So it's a bleak situation, but we can turn it around, and I'm hopeful, and we should all be hopeful.
All right, so you said something interesting. The next 20 or 30 years, you think you can get it done. First, I want to go, before we get into you and who you are, right? Because you just said something interesting about time, which I think people don't talk about enough. How long it actually takes to get some of these things done. First, let's go back into the past. Let's look at the last 10 or 15 or 20 or 30 years. How do we get to the point where Arizona is? And I'm from New Jersey. I've just been here for 6 years. How did Arizona get to the point where 45th or less in multiple categories?
Good question. Well, I'll give you one example. Education funding, right? When I grew up in Tucson area. I went to public schools all the way through. And when I was in middle and high school, we weren't great, but we weren't 50th either. We were ranked about 34th, 35th in the country in terms of how much tax money we were investing in our K through 12 education system per pupil, per child. Today, that number is, even despite the incredible gains, and I have to give incredible respect and credit to the Red for Ed movement and the investing in education efforts, even despite those increases at the behest of the folks who took to the streets in the past 2 years, even despite that, we're now still 47th or 46th in funding. So even despite increased concerted efforts in the last 2 to 3 years, we are still 10 spots behind where we were when I was in 8th or 9th grade.
I actually went to an event with Representative Daniel Hernandez, and he was talking about Arizona being just over $1 billion short per year of just the average.
I think that's accurate, and we're behind where we were even compared to ourselves in 2008 at the outset of the recession, because we didn't plan. We didn't plan financially during the last economic boom time prior to 2008. We didn't set aside funding, and so we of course the tax base disappeared from 2008 to 2012, and we're still recovering from that. So by measuring, compared to other states, we're behind. By measuring to ourselves, historically, we're behind, and I don't see any sense of urgency. I don't see any sense of urgency certainly from Republican lawmakers, but I don't see adequate sense of urgency from many Democratic lawmakers either. So to answer your question about historical, how did we get to where we are? In the last 20 to 30 years, looking backwards, part of it, I don't want to make this into a partisan thing, but there is correlation, I think. The Republicans have had control of the State House of Representatives continuously since 1966. I mean, Democrats haven't had any leadership role in the state legislature since the mid-60s. They've had brief moments in the state Senate where they've had a couple years in control, but not enough to really exert any lasting change.
Don't mind my tearing. It's my contacts. The brightness, something I have to deal with. I'm not sleeping, so anyways.
I know that feeling. We can talk about lack of sleep. So 20, 30 years, where have we gone? It's not just Republican leadership. It's a certain brand of leadership that says taxes are the source of all evil, that we have to do everything we can to eliminate all forms of taxes, reduce all forms of taxes, ranging from, when you look at how the state is funded, we're funded through sales tax and through income tax and property tax and excise tax, things on sales taxes on things like alcohol.
I just heard about that a couple days ago.
Yeah, and so the state leaders have targeted every single source of revenue to the point where we now have a smaller budget than comparable states in terms of population. We have a much smaller overall pie than states that are smaller than us in population.
So is the reasoning for reducing the taxes on those things, I guess, I own a business, I don't want to pay those taxes, therefore I lobby for those taxes to be lowered. So if I own a trucking company, I'm paying less on gasoline tax? Or what's
there's some specific industries that have received specific cuts in recent years, but by and large, it's cuts on taxes to the wealthy. I'll give you an example. Arizona has a 5.6% sales tax currently, meaning that if you and I buy a roll of toilet paper at the grocery store, everyone needs toilet paper. You and I both pay 5.6% whether we're rich, whether we're poor, we all pay the same. However, if you or I were to want to buy a private jet in the state of Arizona, as of 2 years ago, the legislature decided it was wise to eliminate the 5.6% sales tax on purchases of private jets.
Okay.
Now, if you're like me, I'm guessing you're not in the market for a private jet, and
Not
probably
yet.
never will be. And well, I don't want to cap your future income.
Listen to a lot of Grant Cardone. Just bought a jet. He's inspired.
But point being, only certain folks are in the market for private jets. They estimate that cost the state, and let's be clear, that costs public education $5 million a year. There's not many jets that are sold every year, but the handful that are, it generates quite a large amount of revenue, and therefore it should generate a large amount of tax. Not anymore. There's been a number of other exemptions. If you send your kids to private school, you receive a special tax credit, which may seem even-handed at surface level, but if you dig a little bit deeper into it, these tax breaks are by and large not going to families of modest means. They're going to wealthier families who probably would have made the choice to send their kids to private school regardless of the tax incentive. So they're receiving a tax incentive on top of a decision that they would have already made regardless.
So is this would I as a politician be making a strategic move for my career to put these to lower these taxes or to make these decisions? So maybe
So what I'm hoping to promote over the course of the next few months in this campaign is to say we can close the gap on education funding and other shortfalls without raising taxes for the bulk of us. Right? In fact, without raising taxes at all, simply reversing or closing the recent loopholes that have been carved out by the Republican legislature. Surgical, not broad-based tax increases. Closing some of these gaps, like the private jet exemption. We should not be having these types of exemptions, and there's many more examples. But closing just a handful of these things would go a long way in generating hundreds of millions of dollars of additional revenue that we had been earning when I was a child, back when we were 35th in the country. And to be clear, we've never been a tax-heavy state like your home state of New Jersey. New Jersey is notorious for having high property taxes and high income taxes. We've never been that state, right? So even if we were to close some of those, modest exemptions or make some of those modest reforms, we wouldn't be as Republicans like to say, tax and spend state. We would still be a moderate taxed state. So
then on the more cerebral portion of it, convincing people who voted for the legislation who maybe don't benefit from them, right? Or rather, people who voted for, or regular citizens who voted for politicians who convinced them that those tax cuts were for their benefit. How do you convince them that closing those loopholes is not to their detriment?
I think we give specific examples, specific stories. I think the toilet paper versus private jet example is one I like to use because it illustrates things that we all consume versus things that only a select few.
I've never heard that before either,
in the
so
market.
I like that.
And I think we give examples. We have to. I think and that brings. Thank you for asking that question, because part of being a leader in any sector, whether that's political office or in business or nonprofit world, is also being an educator, right? Is having the patience and the storytelling, sometimes the ability to convey and teach and inform and enlighten. And so that's certainly an additional reason I want to run. I mean, I want to run to change laws, but I want to run also to help shine light on issues that are currently languishing in the darkness.